Steve MacBeth, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you giving me your time. A Canadian based in New Zealand. So we've got a 12-hour time difference. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. It's fantastic to speak with you.
Let's start with a bit of Steve MacBeth. Let's introduce Steve MacBeth and how his journey eventually ended or began to, I suppose, intertwine with Afghanistan.
Okay. Well, the reality is I started off as a university student, and I didn't really know what I was doing. Like I probably like a lot of university students, and I sat in on a lecture, an international politics lecture, in my second year of university, and there was a Canadian senior officer, military officer, who came in to speak to my class and spoke about Canadians operating in the former Yugoslavia during that conflict. And I was amazed. I didn't really have a good idea of Canada's military role, probably like lots of young Canadians. And this just kind of captured my imagination that there were Canadians out that were positioned by the government to support international efforts to bring peace and stability to peoples and populations that were affected by conflict. And I thought, wow, it's actually doing something. And I didn't feel like I was doing anything. So I went down to the local recruiting center and signed up. And initially, they had a thought that I would be an officer because I was in university. And I thought, oh, well, how long does that take? And then they told me, well, it'll be another 2 years, finish your degree, and then some training, and then you'll go. And I thought, well, I want something faster than that. And so I joined as a soldier, as an enlisted soldier. So in the military, there's commissioned ranks and non-commissioned members. And I joined as a non-commissioned member in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And so that kind of introduced me into the military setting. And in the first kind of 5 years of my military career, I deployed to the former Yugoslavia, had some training, and then was selected to be an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so then I went back and finished my degree, and then moved over and carried on as an infantry officer in the Royal Canadian Regiment. Now, this was 2001. September 11th, 2001 was my very first day at the Royal Military College. So I had just finished in Bosnia. I was transferred to become an officer, moved to the Royal Military College, and September 11th occurs. And really, the world changes, right? At that point in time, and Afghanistan comes to the forefront of our consciousness. And I wasn't part of it. My previous battalion immediately stood up and was deploying to Afghanistan to the first tour that so Canadians went, responded as early as October 2001, where we started to shift our special forces efforts into Afghanistan. And by early 2002, we had conventional forces on the ground in Kandahar operating there in the initial efforts, like the efforts like the Whale, I think is a famous kind of battle or occurrence that happened then. And so I was going through my formative training and understanding of what it was going to be like to be an infantry officer during that time. And everything shifted. You shifted mindset and perspective from had been a peacekeeping nation to what does Afghanistan mean for Canada, and what does it mean to be a professional soldier? And then between 2003, when I joined my new battalion, and 2014, essentially, my efforts were completely focused on Afghanistan, between either preparing to depart or to train to operate in Afghanistan, to recover from a tour in Afghanistan, or to train somebody else to go to Afghanistan. And so that really is, for a small army, really the way that our life was for that period of time. Because from a percentage standpoint, I mean, there's only about 15,000 professional soldiers, like let's look at infantry and armor, which were the primary, and engineers that were the primary, those primarily tasked to Afghanistan. There's not that many of them. And so you continually cycle through from a conventional forces perspective. And so that was really life between 2003 and kind of 2014 for us.
Canada being, an immediate neighbor of America, and the way the world changed for Americans, and that desire and the anger and the sense of, I don't know, the thirst for vengeance. But for Canada, how did 9/11 change Canada, in a sense? That what I mean is that because of the proximity of Canada to America, and how did 9/11 change Canada?
That's a big question. But I think, like, in the first instance, there's something, one, you have to recognize that there were Canadians killed in New York. And so Canada was directly affected by loss. to Canada opened up its borders immediately to the planes that were in the air. And so the first act of Canada, based from the 9/11 standpoint, was that one, NORAD is a US Canadian combination. And so Canadians were involved directly in the defense of airspace. And then two, Canadians opened up their airports. So when airplanes couldn't land in America or the airspace had to be cleared, Canadians accepted, hundreds, if not thousands of Americans that had to land in little airfields, in Newfoundland and these places, and then housed them and fed them to make sure that, like, as things started to calm down. And so the consciousness is very close for Canada because, I mean, these are Canada's closest neighbors, closest historic allies. We share things like cultural things like the National Hockey League or Major League Baseball or the NBA basketball, in that Canadian teams participate in these leagues, and so there's a cultural crossover. There's probably there's hundreds of families that are connected, and so I think it really struck the Canadian consciousness, and of course, like the rest of the world, there's a feeling of vulnerability, and so I think those all rose together. But in the first instance, there was confusion. No one knew which countries were involved or who was going to be, what was going to occur. And I don't know that vengeance was the first thought on Canadians' minds. I think probably it was protection and consolidation and conscious thought of what is our way forward as a nation.
Canada deployed to Afghanistan. Special forces went to Kandahar. Why Kandahar?
That I was not directly involved in that area. As I understand it, that was publicly, Task Force K-Bar stood up into Kandahar. That was seen as, I think, from the kind of public history, as the epicenter of the Taliban movement and the opportunity to conduct strike actions against Al-Qaeda and Taliban elements that were seen to have propagated the attack of 9/11. And so I think that was the kind of start point, or the center point for action during that time. And I think probably a number of your other guests, like the CIA specialists and special forces specialists, would have a far better understanding as to why. For Canada, I think it was a matter of joining the coalition, being seen to doing something effectively, and utilizing our tools that are available and are expert at this to operate with our ally. And I think there has to be a part of national consciousness that it's seen as a way to disrupt in the away game, so that you're not facing these kind of threats at home, and probably to reinforce the Canadian population that something is happening. You're doing something. You're being active.
Yeah.
Yeah, but remember that mission for Canada in Kandahar was bifurcated. It had the 1 battalion deployment and the Special Forces deployment, and the Special Forces then remained. But Canada withdrew its conventional forces after only one tour of duty. And then the next step we took in Afghanistan is where I got involved, which is the kind of stabilization force at the time, seen as more traditional peacemaking force of ISAF into Kabul. And so it wasn't initially, although there were threats, it was initially seen again as the nation building, nation supporting type role in the first stages of the Canadian deployments.
And how did it feel for you first time landing and smelling the Kandahar air?
So I didn't land in Kandahar initially. I landed in Kabul. So my first tour was in Kabul, and it's an interesting approach into Kabul in a C-130, which is a transport aircraft, in that they have to corkscrew down based off the elevation, and so it's quite an effort. And then when you get off, I mean, obviously the city. It's a massive city with a massive population that doesn't necessarily have the best sewage system, and so it's a shock to the systems initially. And we arrived in the winter for that, and so that was also it. So you're at altitude, so you have to adjust to high altitude and just different oxygen levels, which takes a little bit of adjustment. You have the heavy braziers where people are warming their homes with whatever they
Yeah.
can find, burn, and so it kind of holds like a low level smog.
Old tires and rubber and
That's right.
everything goes.
Yeah, and that kind of plasticky, rubbery smell is something that I think sticks with you, or sticks with anybody that experienced that environment. And then you have the kind of massive population. I think at the time it was between 2 and 2.5 million people in the city. And I think more people had come back to Kabul because of the stabilization efforts of NATO, and where they had put there was essentially Kabul, and then outside of Kabul there was the American Operation Enduring Freedom. And so there's these two parallel efforts going on that were supposed to be mutually supporting, and there were the nations in NATO that were not participating in the overt strike combat operations outside of Kabul, and then the stabilization efforts to support the nascent government of Afghanistan, to try to build up what could be some type of democratic leadership.
When did you find your way to Kandahar?
So in that same tour, so Canada switched its efforts about halfway through, and I think this was triggered by the American efforts or invasion of Iraq around 2003. That then required extra forces from the U.S. to go to Iraq. Canada was not going to be involved in the invasion of Iraq, and so they looked to expand. We looked to expand our efforts in Afghanistan. And again, there are professional historians that know this story will really happen, and that's not where my expertise lies. It's just what I understood being on the ground. So we were up in Kabul, and then our job was then to start to move the Canadian efforts from Kabul to Kandahar. And it's about 385 kilometers.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating for me to depart Kabul, which we'd gotten used to from the city edges. And it was almost like the perception, it was like there's this giant moat, and you never went outside this kind of like area around Kabul. And then to be exposed to the shift was significant for us, because different people's different motivations, and then different efforts had been going on outside of Kabul, and that was a big wake up call. I think I remember that in our first instance, Canada was quite new at this type of effort, and I was a young platoon commander, so that's about leading about 30 soldiers, and we're escorting these convoys, and our radios only really worked within Kabul because of the repeater system
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we would lose, except for talking to ourselves, and then maybe talking to whatever kind of disparate American fob was on the way. We didn't have communications with anybody. And if you think about the threat at the time, in the 24 hours prior to our departing Kabul to go to Kandahar, there had been, I think, something like 26 IED strikes in that 385 kilometers. And so we weren't necessarily well set up nor conditioned for the levels of violence. Now, Canadians had lost soldiers in Kabul due to suicide and IED attack, but we hadn't faced kind of the capabilities that the Taliban could bring to the table in terms of the combination of automatic weapons, anti-armor weapons, and IED and complex ambush. And so I think like I was lucky rather than good on those first couple of trips, in that we didn't really face anything. And I think probably the Taliban are adjusting to who are these new people in the area, because they hadn't seen a LAV, a light armored vehicle before with a 25 millimeter cannon. They didn't understand the capabilities. And so I think that was something that kind of preserved us in those initial phases of the movement
Yeah, I
into
mean the thing
Kandahar.
is Afghanistan is such a, it's mountainous, but it's also got such a varied terrain as well. As you can,
Absolutely.
Kandahar is not very mountainous. Like,
No.
it's just at the edge of the Registan Desert. So that's, your Kandahar. And I mean, what kind of preconceptions did you have about Afghanistan before getting into Afghanistan? And what was your biggest culture shock when you got there? And of course, then you can go to Kandahar and tell me about your shocks there.
Yeah. So I think that I had served only one mission before in Bosnia. And so just if you think you leave like these amazing nations that we live in, and you go to nations that are affected by war. The Yugoslavian war had been a terrible 5 to 7 years in nations that, Yugoslavia hosted the Olympics, I think, in 1984. And so it was a fully, like, had high rates of literacy, had high rates of medical capability, had like,
And had a
and,
good
and
football team as well in
that's
1998.
right. And then was torn apart by this civil war, and it needed to be put back together. And it took a huge amount of effort, and still does take a huge amount of effort from the international community to commit to that. And so what I found when I went into Afghanistan initially was that you're integrating into a nation that's had 25 years or 30 years of conflict, and then doesn't have any of that start point that maybe Yugoslavia did. And so it's going to take dramatically more investment if we hope to get it out. And I think that the normalization of violence was probably at all levels of society was something that was a real shock to me. So whether that be, I can remember that children playing like chicken wrestling,
Hmm.
where they hold one leg
Right.
up behind them and they
Yeah.
bounce around on one leg, and then they're working on the side of a hill. And that hill might have old Russian minefields in it, and they have no fear to like push each other over to be able to do that. And their response when they get angry will immediately, be violent with each other, which is a different way than you see children interacting in different parts of the world. And this isn't judgment. This is just observation.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Um, it's the same, and just like in every country, that this isn't applied to everyone, but it's just what we would observe at times with interactions between males and females, particularly married couples, and the levels of net institutionalized violence that occurred within the family. And so that normalization of violence, I think, and but the willingness, the survival instinct was incredible. So I think if you take those two pieces, one, that there is at every level or at every age, there's institutionalized or violence that is normalized, and then this incredible will to survive and thrive in this environment that has not been designed for anyone to survive or thrive in. I found an incredible spirit, and really kind of like drove me down into that, like enjoying at where I could the my interactions with the Afghan people. And that really didn't come along. We had very limited interactions when we were in Kabul, but in Kandahar, particularly with our allies and partners, as the relationship matured between ourselves and the Afghan National Forces, our security forces, and then the populations that we could engage with in a positive way, that really matured over the next couple of times that I went to Afghanistan.
Kandahar being the birthplace of the Taliban, and then you've got Canadian forces patrolling the villages, trying to protect, the populations, trying to protect Afghan forces, institutions, trying to bring a semblance of governance, I suppose, as is, your task would have been, as well as pursuing all other things. What kind of level was the community engagement because of that pre-existing history of Kandahar?
Yeah, so I think like when I returned to Afghanistan, so I my first tour would have been kind of 2004, 2005. And I was home only for about 9 months. And then I returned in August of 2006. This was kind of a critical juncture in both the NATO mission and in Kandahar. And so there had been between 2001 and 2005, I think, a bit of a honeymoon period. The Taliban had definitely been mitigated or reduced. And then they'd had a resurgence kind of in 2005 in that Kandahar region, and specifically in the region that we were going into in Panjwai and Zari, which really was Mullah Omar's neck of the woods and his birthplace and his hometown.
Yeah.
And so the population that we interacted with there was strongly conversant in the Taliban interactions and had huge support. And so there's again this feeling of arriving, thinking that you're there to help people,
Mm.
and there are many people that don't want your help, and that's a big wake up call, right? For a Canadian soldier, and that was probably the biggest shift in terms of mindset, and then trying to figure out there are still pockets of the population that do want your help. And then how do you suss out those pockets of the population while at the same time literally fighting for your life against other parts of the population that really don't want your help, don't want you there, and don't understand why you would impose yourself into that because they don't recognize a central government, and they're at no time do they want to have a foreign interaction inside of their terrain. So, and it was fascinating. Like when we went up the Turncout Road into Erskine. There were smaller villages. I didn't on the tour that was there before us that had been mistaken. There were groups of people that didn't understand the difference between Canadian and the old like Russian presence.
Yeah.
Is that at a distance?
So a
There's
foreigner is
not
a
much.
foreigner.
It's foreigner is a foreigner, and you've got a wheeled vehicle with a turret on it that looks an awful lot like a Russian wheeled vehicle. And so have the Russians just returned? And so I think that there was a whole host of layers to the discussion. And I can remember speaking with my A&A partner, and his it was interesting because he was Tajik, and his XO, or his second in command, was Pashto. And I can remember the discussion. It was very interesting because one of the efforts with the Afghan National Army had been to integrate Hazara, Pashto, Tajik all into the same battalion construct. Now, whether or not that worked well or not, I think the maturation of the force, like this was a relatively senior Kandak, and so had some maturation. But I can remember the two of them. We would sit down for our evening meal, and they would have debates. And I mean, the Pashto gentleman would go right to the Durand line and be like, "Nah, there's not even a country here. Like the country is different than how you guys see the country. The country is actually oriented this way, and our country." You know, he would talk about Pashtoistan goes this way into Pakistan, and that's how we should be orienting our efforts. And so here's a guy that holds a relatively senior rank in the Afghan National Army that honestly believes like this war is just a stop, is just a holding line until all the foreigners leave, so that Afghanistan can sort out its own business, which may look a little bit different than everyone expects.
But what were the, people's reactions to your presence? For example, patrolling village to village, holding bases. Did you
Yeah.
have, you know, that certain amount of knowledge, understanding of the local communities that you would know which clan belongs to which group of the Taliban? And I mean, how much of our understanding you eventually developed as to how real and how tangible and how, whether some sort of, okay, that village, the son of that clan are the Taliban, so we're not gonna, how are we gonna communicate with them?
Yeah, so but I would say that it comes at the end. That doesn't happen in the first of your 6 months. That doesn't even happen in the end, the second of your 6 months. That probably happens between month 12 and month 18 of your time in Afghanistan. And so if you think about the issue of rotational basis or rotational knowledge, the average Canadian soldier would spend between 6 and 9 months in theater and then would rotate back to Canada. And so then there would be a gap, and then they would come back again. And so when you came back to the same ground, by the time I came back to Panjwai for the kind of third time, now I felt like I had a better understanding because the characters were kind of the same. And but in that first instance, no. So if you think there's 2,500 people into that part of Afghanistan, and then at 7 months, 2,500 people leave and a new 2,500 show up, it takes 3 or 4 cycles before those
So
people that
that
were there the first.
relationship kind of breaks down and somebody else has to come and rebuild that relationship.
That's right. And it doesn't allow for great continuity. It was something that, when we look back now, we wonder if the rotation basis is it too short? Is it too long? Is it the right design? And I think that, I mean, these are talks just amongst the practitioners because there was a lot of pressure to maintain the 6 month cycle.
Mm.
And so, but in a environment where it's about creating relationships and understanding, that may not be a workable model.
Yeah.
And so what did that mean? It meant that you had different ways of doing things every 6 to 7 months. As much as you try to maintain continuity, I think that people that study this from a strategy standpoint would probably say that these changes and losses of momentum probably impacted the ability on the ground to have coherence. And so I think that would be a an easy thing. And you learn the environment significantly. So as someone who is on the ground, you learn in your first couple of weeks, like everything seems like a threat. And
Yeah.
then once you learn it, you recognize more, you understand far more well what is an actual threat or the type of environment you're going to be working in or the area that you're working in, like you said. And so I think like there's a story in the book that kind of it's talking about a young corporal who's leading a patrol, and then there's somebody who's brand new into theater, and the person that's new is looking at everything that's a threat, and the person that's more experienced is very relaxed up until a point. And there is this point in Panjwai where you would leave the hard packed road by Masumgar, which is where one of the major bases were, and then you would shift to head to the west onto the Horn of Panjwai, and this area was like very well known as a Taliban stronghold. And the person who's telling the story relays that he could see the shift in these professionals that had been in for 7 to 8 months already, and all of a sudden, like helmet straps got tightened, weapons were prepared, and they understood that in the next, 1,000 meters, likely you cross a magic line, and that's
Hmm.
where you'll hit contact. And so it's that appreciation, I think, that takes some time to learn when you're working in that type of environment.
Canada, such a major player in the war. I was looking. It had the second highest casualty rate per capita of all the allies. You know,
Yeah,
Denmark per capita is the highest, and Canada the second. And
yeah.
as you know, Canadian soldiers not returning home or either returning maimed, how did the political narrative around the country develop? I mean,
So there was initially a massive wave. So if you look at the transition from peacemaking or peacekeeping in Kabul to the combat-focused mission in Kandahar, there was initially a massive wave of kind of nationalism, and there would be these efforts in Ottawa called Red Fridays, where there would be thousands of people that would arrive on Parliament Hill to support soldiers, and the prime minister would say very like brave things like these colors don't run. And I think that this kind of naivete of what it meant to be committed to this type of thing really didn't start to hit home until we started losing soldiers at a faster rate than Americans were losing soldiers in some of the most dangerous parts of Iraq. And I think between 2006 and 2009, being a Canadian soldier in Kandahar was one of the most dangerous things to be in the world. And there was probably a couple of reasons for that. As I understand it, there was a strategic tactical opportunity for the Taliban to try to impose as many losses as possible on countries like Canada or Denmark, because the feeling was that you could fracture NATO and then they would withdraw once casualties started to occur. And that's what led to the kind of the very first, as I understand it, one of the first battles that we fought that I was involved in Kandahar in 2006, which was known as Operation Medusa.
yeah.
And that was actually the time that the Taliban had decided, well, we're going to stand and fight conventionally because we don't believe that NATO has the political will to come and clear out this pocket of 800 or 900 Taliban fighters, and that if we impose enough losses, we'll see the backside of NATO as they return to their countries because they won't take the political loss. And so I think initially Canadians hardened their hearts and hardened their idea to committing to improving Afghanistan. And you didn't see this just from the population because this was not an election issue for Prime Minister Harper. In fact, he was very popular with these type of decisions. And then we had, by 2009, having lost, I think, just over 100 soldiers by that point in time and just over, I think, 2,000 wounded or 1,800 wounded. I'm not sure the exact numbers. They had a look at whether or not what were we doing right or wrong that were required. And then they invested billions of dollars to improve equipment. So Chinook helicopter squadron, C-17 transport aircraft, the movement of the Chinooks had escort helicopters, Griffins with miniguns placed on them, and the new armored vehicles fleet that could protect the soldiers from a better way. And so this investment was massive. And then just after that is when the government announced that it would end the combat mission in 2011, 2012, which changed the dynamic on the ground and changed the dynamic for the soldiers and changed the dynamic, I think, for the population because people then were just holding their breath until we were out, and then we shifted back up north into an advised assist mission in Mazar-e Sharif.
And you mentioned Operation Medusa. It was one of the, you know, it kind of became legendary that, that operation. So set the scene for Operation Medusa.
Yeah, so we arrived in we arrived in August 2006. The one PPCLI battle group had been involved in major operations, and I would say Operation Mountain Thrust precluded Operation Medusa. And so it's a very dangerous time because you have fresh troops coming in without experience and the experienced troops just departing at that point in time. And they had had a terrible day. The day that I arrived in theater, August 3rd, I believe, they'd had a terrible day in that the person that I was replacing had been wounded, and they'd had four soldiers killed in a running battle across the Arghandab River at what became now the kind of infamous white schoolhouse on the southern tip of Zari as it overlooked into Panjwai. And so when we got off the plane, this was a completely different setting than when we had arrived in Kabul, in that we were gripped immediately by the in-place force. And then we were made to understand like this isn't a relief in place, it's kind of a relief in contact, and you should anticipate contact the minute that you're departing. We were then provided a series of briefs and understood that the Taliban was aggregating in Zari and Panjwai, and that the reality was that they had hoped to disrupt NATO and then encircle Kandahar and then start the same thing they had done earlier to take charge, which is the same playbook they had used. Cut Highway 1, encircle Kandahar, own Kandahar, and then start to dominate the terrain that way. And it was going to be our job to clean that pocket out. And so I think that is kind of a dramatic entry. And in our first moments of the new battle group taking charge, Alpha Company, the one PPC, the PPCLI company that was attached to our battle group, got in a major contact down in Panjwai, and so they went down to conduct a reconnaissance in force. I don't know that the Taliban understood the night vision capabilities of the lab system at that point in time. And so the Taliban attacked in waves onto this rifle company. And the rifle company basically fought through the night and were able to hold off the attack. But there was a couple of things that showed us. One, they were attacking in a cohesive, comprehensive manner, so conducting fire and movement, so professional drills that you wouldn't necessarily attribute to this type of fighter. They were able to bring together anti-armor systems, heavy machine gun systems, and then maneuver to try to assault what is 145 heavily armed
So in a sense, they
soldiers
were
with
well trained.
yeah, well, and at the time, and again, you'd have to go back to the intelligence reports. As we understood it, they had some advisors, either from Pakistan advisors or Chechen advisors on the ground at that point in time, and you could see how they were fighting. It was much different than how it had been described to us, where we would be fighting section level small elements that would kind of shoot and scoot. These were, it looked like semi-professionals that were able to aggregate and then conduct more conventional type operations. So that set the stage for a set of orders. And in my role as the reconnaissance and sniper platoon commander, to start to go to develop the enemy situation. And then that was our role, my role throughout that fight. What disrupted it is once we were attached Dutch artillery. We were attached, I believe, a Danish reconnaissance squadron. We had a special forces element that was going to look at a disrupt task to the south in the Raj Desert and around Spurwangar, which was a major node to the south out on the Panjwai Horn. And then the main thrust of the battalion would be to clear out this pocket in Zari. And this is where I guess the stage gets set, is that the isolation of the area was established. The local nationals that lived in the area were warned. And one of the interesting things that I don't think is well understood of people who study Medusa is that I think there was something like 15,000 civilians that departed the area. And so what occurred then is you have this kind of isolated zone where every civilian that's going to leave has left, and anybody who remains in that area is there for a reason. And that's different than fighting in and amongst the people where the population is blended with your opposition force. And so that sets the tone kind of for around early September of 2006. And let's face it, for Canada, this was a massive undertaking and something that hadn't occurred, a deliberate attack onto a fortified enemy position since the Korean War, I believe, is how we understood it. And so that's kind of conditions set. And then the battle group arrives to prepare its opportunity. And then my role in this had changed significantly in that we had a UK plane crash. Nimrod
Yeah.
crashed And it was my responsibility then. I was pulled off of the where the assaulting force was going to occur and moved to do the recovery operation because for NATO, a crashed aircraft became the highest priority. And so it was a bad start to the operation. And so I guess that kind of sets the tone of you've got about between 800 and 1,000 Canadians poised to conduct an offensive operation from Panjwai into Zari. You have some allies supporting with fires and with reconnaissance, and an ANA element and special forces element that are attached in that kind of forms this body of troops that will conduct Operation Medusa. And that was my introduction to Kandahar.
That's
So,
quite dramatic.
it's very dramatic, and you don't really have a chance to, like, when you talked about your interactions, we didn't have local interactions like you would imagine we had in Kabul, because the first instinct was this very dramatic shift to conduct Operation Medusa.
I'm really interested into this human to human interactions of people you were fighting against, and also these were the people who were, from the same villages, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we didn't have the, so again, if we just situated into that early September timeframe, we were not the experienced soldiers that were departing. We were brand new. And so it had where the last rotation had all these kind of interactions with the population. And we had been told is that it was almost like there was a switch that got flipped at a certain time of year. And the people that had been living in these regions over the winter either didn't exist anymore or moved out, and new people moved in, new people kind of in quotations, and that the feeling of the villages changed significantly. And this Medusa didn't just happen overnight. It happened over a slow build of a series of small contacts growing into bigger contacts. And so the last rotation, Task Force Orion, who we took over from, they had this constant pressure and build since early spring. And so their reflection was, even if we don't understand it, because we didn't understand the difference between, I guess, what would be classified fighting season and not fighting season,
Yeah.
or summer and winter, for lack of a better term. This was our first experience as Canadians with that kind of reality, where you would have this long stretch of nothing, and then all of a sudden, the magical switch would get flipped, and you had this very intense capability that you'd be facing. And that was what we'd had. But what you share in terms of listening on we call it an ICOM, like a small radio that can
Yeah, yeah,
intercept.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you had to stop your interpreter sometimes from getting on the radio and then yelling at the Taliban, and they would, they would yell back. And so that was something that was good. But my first experience really with a Kandahar National was kind of incredible in that we had the Nimrod crash, and during this Nimrod crash, the pilots had been amazing, and they'd put it down into an area that was very low, like in a very congested population area. They had shifted the plane so that it would not hit a population center, but it was surrounded by population centers. And so, of course, there was a huge interest in getting there. Now, there was a huge interest from the Taliban because I think they were interested in the bodies or in the secret information that was on the plane. And so our job was to go secure the site and then to pick up, sadly, the fallen UK air personnel that were on the crash site. And so when my organization arrived, one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure, because aircraft have lots of poisonous gases, and there could be secondary explosions. And so kids immediately came through into the site. And so, working carefully, we wanted to shepherd them away from that area, but we also had a responsibility to secure it. And I met an older gentleman, and who was kind of sitting on this wall, and he obviously had a stake in the region. And so I went over to speak to him with my interpreter, and we got to know each other. And he immediately kind of took control of the local situation and then kept everyone away. And so we knew that we'd had a contact with someone who had some, cachet in the
Influence.
area, influence. That's right. And interestingly, he ran a taxi cab for his job. That's what he did. And so even though there has been this dramatic plane crash and there had been all this kind of disruption in the area, and there was a threat, the Taliban had been noted they were starting to maneuver into the area. His biggest concern was to ask me, like, how do I not get shot by NATO troops? Like, if I'm driving a cab, I'm going to drive my cab after this is all over, but I don't want to get shot. And I don't understand why people take warning shots at me. And I thought it was a really interesting, initial point because he's like, really, dude, I don't want to get shot here. I've got a business to run and I don't
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
have to
yeah,
risk
yeah.
every time I get on the road. And so, anyways, we developed a relationship with this guy, and we had to spend about 2 days on the site. And each time we spent a day, we became more vulnerable because there was only so many exits from where the
Yeah,
site
yeah, yeah,
was.
yeah, yeah.
And so we knew that the Taliban were operating in the area, and that their habit had been to lay ambush and IEDs for because you're most vulnerable when you go to move. And so I asked this guy about a way out, and I had to rejoin the battle group. We had to rejoin the battle group to get on with the next phases of Medusa, because Medusa was going on
Yeah,
during
yeah.
this time. And so in the end, I was like, well, he probably knows. Like my suspicion was he probably knew the people in the village that were involved on the Taliban side. So he probably also didn't want to get blown up as an IED. And so I asked him actually for a cab ride. And
That's clever. That's very clever.
and so what I did to do my own reconnaissance for a route out is I had him with his cab, and we hopped in, myself, my and translator and a security guy hopped in with him and paid him to take on a back route that we wouldn't have been able to find. And we had small vehicles, we had Jeeps to take us out of this very congested area. And I thought from his own self-preservation. So maybe a not a
Well, the thing
useful.
is, I'm looking at it now. I mean, he could have just driven
That's right.
into one of those houses and handed you all kind of, to the next
Well,
Taliban commander.
yeah, we put in some security protocols and traced ourselves. But anyways, probably young platoon commander, not smartest thing to do. But it was an interesting, but it's an interesting first interaction
Yeah,
with
yeah.
with Afghan from Kandahar. And so like rapport is built. We start to understand what's going on. We understand there's a threat. We try to utilize local knowledge to get us out of the area. And yeah, and so really, for me, that was my first. This cab driver who held influence in the village was my first interaction with Afghan Pashto leader.
But leaving Afghanistan for the last time, how did it feel?
Not great, and I didn't believe it was my last time. So when I left, I didn't think it was being my last time because there'd
You
be nothing
survived
that
Operation Medusa. You survived the taxi driver. You,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, and then I had my third tour was an OMLT tour, so Operational Mentor Liaison Team tour, which was probably the best interaction. Was a very tough tour, but it was the best interaction. So in 2009, I returned to Afghanistan for the third time, and in this time, I was partnered with an Afghan National Army leader and a Kandak or a battalion, so about 800 Afghan soldiers, and I had a team of about 30. And our job was to live and fight with them in Zari and Panjway. And my team, I was very lucky. My team was very experienced. Everyone had 2 or 3 tours in Afghanistan already, and that was kind of purposely designed that way. And I had a personal relationship with this Afghan leader because in the 2006 tour, they were the ANA element 21205, so second Kandak, 205 Corps was the Kandak that had been attached to our battalion for Operation Medusa, and then we had operated with for 6 to 8 months. And so I had interaction with this leader when he was not the commanding officer of the Kandak. And so we knew each other. So when I came back, this is where those relationships and that depth of understanding really starts to evolve by your third tour,
mm,
because now you've got relationships inside of the population, people that live, and you get a deeper understanding of the way that business is done, kind of on by my third tour. So yeah, the last time I left Afghanistan, if that's the question, I really felt like I'd be back
mm.
because that was what had happened up until that point in time, and that I felt that I had a much deeper understanding and commitment to the people than what had been like in my first tour, a peacekeeping, and relatively benign tour in Kabul.
Mm.
then a extremely violent tour based on combat actions in my second tour. My third tour, then the Taliban had changed tactics. We were far more in and amongst the population. The counterinsurgency doctrine had been fully implemented, and I was living as a small element. So my personal security counted on Afghans. Like
Yeah.
every night I went to bed, I was safe because I was living with an Afghan, not because I was living in a Canadian or American environment. And so that's a completely different mind shift from that. And so I left Afghanistan at that point in time, thinking that I had hoped that there was still an opportunity for the mission to be successful and for the Afghan people to
But
find peace.
it's really interesting you say that because, the book is such a, such a great read, but also is it your, no names, no pack drills, and oral history of Canadians at war in Afghanistan? So is it your, I don't know, paying homage to your comrades? Is it, finding in some way catharsis in this to tell their story and hear their story? Maybe let it go?
Yeah, well, I don't know that we'll ever let it go. I think that we're quite connected. In fact, that individual, I just don't want to say his name. I don't want to put him at any risk. I'm still connected with that individual now 15 years later, and we've been
Yeah.
trying to figure out a path to get him out of Afghanistan. And so I don't know that it ever really leaves your consciousness. What I found when I was starting to think about the book was that there were the professional historians, of which I'm
Yeah.
not one,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and they have the very technical aspects of what happened and why decisions were made. There were the general officers who were in charge of everything and so had their perspective. And then there were the individual relays of where people would have dramatic events and they would talk about their single experience. What I felt missing was the a broadening of that experience so that we could take a collection, an aggregate of stories and population that would give us a perspective of the Canadian soldiers' experience during that time in Afghanistan, and that no one above the rank of major was interviewed. And for
Mm.
the most part, the majority of the interviews were from private soldier, or at the time when they were serving, they were private soldiers up to sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. And so those people that were consistently in the forefront of the activities and interacting with Afghan population, having to combat the enemy and having to survive inside the environment was really what the book was about. Why it's no names, no pack drill is because that's an expression that comes from the UK
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
where pack drill is a punishment.
Yeah.
And so when you want to, if a soldier has done something wrong, they'll have to put on a heavy rucksack and they'll conduct parade drill in a very small square and it'll make them very tired. And so when a leader wants to tell another leader a story and they want the leader to get a lesson, but they don't want them to exact any punishment, this is the catchphrase that they use. And they'll say, I'll say, Ro, I've got a story for you, but I know that you're a senior leader and you may want to like exact some punishment here. I'm going to give you the disclaimer of no names, no pack drill, meaning that I just want you to listen to the story. I want you to know that it's going on, and I want you to let's take the lessons from it. And so, what I wanted from the book was I know that soldiers and Canadian soldiers, I think all soldiers, are fairly humble about their activities and about their like what they've done. They also know that they don't trust their memory because combat
Yeah.
actions
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
whole bunch of different things, and they don't want to get something wrong, and they don't want to be publicly embarrassed by that. And so, what I wanted to offer was a kind of an anonymous opportunity that
Yeah.
they could share their stories with somebody who shared the same experiences, and they could feel that they could be trusted to share that piece. So it was
To
for Afghanistan. It was for the soldiers. It wasn't really,
yeah.
like I think there's a whole all those reasons that you said are true, and there's a segment of wanting to let the soldiers tell their stories. There's a segment of catharsis, and there's a segment of not wanting Afghanistan to be completely lost from the Canadian population's consciousness because there's still an issue now that should be addressed. And so it's wanting to share the sacrifice of the time. It wasn't just a lost cause. And so what did it mean to us? And so
Yeah,
maybe we
so
need to reflect.
that question of what did it mean to you? I mean, you mentioned, one of the things that comes a lot when you speak to, people who are involved in there, whether they were soldiers or commanders or bureaucrats, they all, the first few words that come to their mind, one of them is definitely people, the people of Afghanistan. So And I was watching an interview with a couple of Canadian soldiers who had fought in Afghanistan. One of them had lost two legs there, and it was in the aftermath of the August 2021.
Yeah.
And, they were kind of all in tears about, yeah, we went there and we did what we were asked to do by our leaders, our country. But what really hurts is not the way things have ended, but I had my friends killed there. I lost two legs there, but I still have left a piece of my heart with those people. The very same people from whose homes you'd be shot at. So, what is it? I mean, you just explain that.
I think that um, that's the tension. That was the tension when you operated there, and that's the tension afterwards. Because my I have an experience where I was going into a village that had heavy Taliban involvement, and we had received contact from. And I met this gentleman, and he just had moved back from Pakistan because he wanted a better life from his family, and he understood that NATO was in this area of Kandahar and that life was going to get better. And then he'd point to the power lines and say, "How come there's no power to my village yet?" But we developed a relationship with him, and this individual was quite brave, and he started reporting on like potential IED sites and things like that. And so it was incredible. But he was doing it specifically because he wanted a better life for his. He had two sons and he had four daughters. And here is a gentleman who, like, when you went into he invited us into his home, and in his home he had it was all very well neatly maintained. The mud huts as they are in Kandahar, but incredibly well maintained. And he had taken, like the calendars that have international capitals. So there'd be like a calendar that would show Paris.
Yes,
And
yes, yes, yeah.
he had cut out like Paris and London, and they were the decorations, because in his mind, he believed that Afghanistan had a world-class capability in the 60s and 70s and could return to it. And so he used these little pictures as an example of to his children of like, this is what the world is like outside of where we live, and we should hope to get our country to this point. And so I think that's the issue. So when you're a soldier there, you have from the very same houses that you visit, you can hit a contact or ID just as you turn the corner. And so you have this constant tension of, this immediate fear and hatred and loathing of the people that are causing that violence. And then you have this protection mechanism by which you're trying to protect the people that are trying to make their lives better and are trying to just survive as humans. And it's a very human contact. And I think
Mhm.
that the thing that hurts for people, and I didn't like that soldier that lost both his legs. We've lost friends, but the loss of autonomy or the loss of agency for vast swaths of the Afghan population, I think is what really hurt about the withdrawal. And as a Canadian, we don't have much of a stance because our country withdrew militarily, in 2014. So that was still 6 or 7 years prior to the actual full
Yeah, yeah.
withdrawal. And so that also is something that's problematic for the veteran population. But I think that it's that like there was all this commitment. You could see improvement. You could see between my first visit in 2003 and my departure in 2011, you could see massive change. And my Afghan partner was, I thought, very clever in his description of this, because he said, we come from very peaceful nations, and so we think this is violence. But he's like, our levels of violence under the Russians and our levels of violence under the warlords were dramatically worse than the experience that you're experiencing now here in NATO. And he said, so for us, this is a level of stability that we haven't seen in a generation. And so you don't think that you're seeing any success. But if you look at it through the view of the last 25 or 30 years, this is a dramatic success. And so I thought that was a very interesting perspective, because we only have our own bias or perspective to be able to look on it as. And when you look at somebody who's spent their whole adult life seeking to improve Afghanistan, I think that's something that stuck with us. And so I think that's probably what stays with us, or the regret is the loss of potential, like the opportunity cost of that population that can't fulfill their full potential now, based on that.
What did Afghanistan experience do to Canada, the Canada's sense of self?
I don't know. I wonder if it became more. uh, like not critical, isn't the right word, but I think that it's a little bit more suspect of grandiose gestures,
Mm.
right? And so if you think about that, you have initially the only time Article 5 has been declared, NATO is in a situation of everyone agreeing that this is the right thing to do. Afghanistan is a country that's worthy of investment from the Western world, and therefore we're going to both do security and development simultaneously. And then to see that it's like we didn't think through the problem. And so if we go back to the Yugoslavia problem, you know, I think there are still forces there, and that's going on 30 years, right?
Yeah.
You're starting with a dramatically worse situation, and you're not willing to
It's actually
stay.
still one of Europe's, potential hotspots. So
That's right. And so I think that the Canadian population, and again, I don't want to speak for the Canadian population, so I'll look at it through my own lens. I would be highly suspect of a choice again if there isn't a true commitment to what the end state is of a an operation like that. And so, like, clearly defining our terms and then clearly resourcing it at a level that allows you to be successful, I think would be the minimum standard that would be demanded, which is different than the idealism that existed in the early 2000s.
but
Like,
what
I
would you
think there'd be
say?
a real.
What would you say to somebody who'd say, it was all for nothing?
I,
Like, how would you say
I,
that?
I, yeah, I can't. I don't. I reject that out of hand. I don't agree with that because I believe that we've got an enriched uh, now like diaspora around the world, the Afghan diaspora that has seen great success and can bring an enriched view of that part of the world and its issues and have been able to develop. Now, do I wish that we had been able to do that within Afghanistan and been ultimately successful? Of course. But I can't help but think that there's a massive percentage of the population that has seen benefit because of the investments that we've made. And like a personal example for me would be that my translator, who I was quite close with, who served multiple tours in Kandahar, before I left in 2010, I moved him up to kind of a higher profile position in Kabul. And then from there, we were able to get him into the system to move himself and his family to Toronto. And now he's a small business owner in Toronto, and he's able to his family. He's had a larger migration. I believe he's brought over different parts of his family, and he's able to be successful and happy and productive in Toronto. And so his children will be great Canadians. And I
Mm.
can't help but think that in itself, although not the perfect situation, is probably an example that people could use as a failure, but I think is a localized success.
Would you do all over again?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think like now I'm looking at it as a 50-year-old man with a family. So
You don't look
so
50 though.
oh, there you
You
go.
look
Thank you.
45 at best.
Yeah, there we go. I appreciate that. But I think that the you're young. I was younger at the time, and I didn't have a family, and so there are different considerations there. But if I put myself back into my into that self and that wanting to contribute something that was tangible, then I would absolutely want to be involved again. I will caveat that with I do believe that the nations have a responsibility to decide if they're going to put their young people like
Mm.
me at risk, that they commit to it and resource it and decide if it's worth it to them, right? Like so if the feeling of the average soldier to go over is that we're going to fight the Taliban and we're going to improve the we're going to support democracy within Afghanistan and we're going to improve the life of Afghans. That has to be the same goals that the government has. If the government goal is really we're going to make sure that we support our largest trading partner until a point that it's no longer worth it,
Mm.
then right, that's a different math. And
But what?
it's a realistic thing too, and I've got no problem
Yeah,
with
yeah,
that,
yeah.
actually.
When you tell stories of Afghanistan to your children, what are the upbeat stuff that you tell them? What are the hopeful stuff that you tell them? What are I suppose, the hopeful anecdotes that you share with them? I'm sure they're all very, very proud of what you've done.
I think that probably don't share at all really in detail, but I think when I do, I actually talk about the human spirit that I witnessed, like in the face of adversity. And so I had seen children that without parents that developed like their own little business.
Yeah,
And so in the streets of Pansray, they would have their own little stall, and these two kids were making their own kind of coat racks out of leftover pieces of metal and stuff that they found. And that was always stood out to me as this like indefatigable human spirit.
yeah,
And then I think the human interaction, so two people, myself and my Afghan partner, that should have no business being friends. We have no commonality whatsoever. We found very deep kind of common ground on top of our professional relationship
yeah,
of seeking to defeat the Taliban in our region. We shared understandings of family and family values. We had understandings of like humor and laughter. And these are unforgettable moments that show a humanness, if you
yeah.
will, between those groups that are absent from the violence that was experienced. And so I think that's an important like snapshot.
You have not mentioned pomegranate.
Yeah. Yeah. Eating the pomegranate or the melons in the area or the grapes.
Yes.
And I mean, yeah, like my favorite time, I always often because we're offset a cycle, I would wake up early sometimes to get on the sat phone to call home. But Kandahar stars in the skies,
Yeah.
and that moment of quiet. So there's a moment like just before first call to prayer where the sky is still like black and the stars are they're just incredible because there is no light. There are no non-natural lights in the area. Everything's blacked out. And so the vastness of that and kind of where the desert has yet to heat up is just so dramatic. And you have this dramatic move between like the Reg Desert and then to the green spaces where you find grapes and pomegranates and melons. And so I think there's a whole bunch of good things that I can relate to and can remember. And it's not all negative. I mean, we've had a fairly serious conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's an example in the book that's important is that I think at the end, the reflections, there's reflections on the nation, there's reflections on was it worth it? And whether or not there's most of the reflections were about that there's probably no large changes that occurred, but there were micro changes that are successful and should be celebrated.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, and that there was growth, there was positive, there's negative, but there was positive growth that occurred for the people that participated. And so I think that is an important part of the book.
We get personal stories of soldiers, commanders, generals, politicians about what they witnessed, what their analysis of Afghanistan is. But we don't often get things like this book because it tells the stories from the eyes of the soldiers who had to fight the war. And we definitely do not have anything like this from the Afghan soldiers' point of view because they bore the brunt of everything that went there, and now they are the ones who are suffering. So I do hope that there are people who will, tell their stories because, the Afghan war, the way it ended, it is
Yeah,
essentially, you know, amongst all the things that are overshadowed is, the stories of their heroism has been
yeah.
subdued by all the things that happened after. I think that's not something that we should forget. And I do hope that, we get their stories written by whoever's listening to this. If you're able and capable of doing things like that, please do.
Yeah, and I think like that's so the one chapter I think that speaks to is there's a chapter specifically that's dedicated to the Afghans.
Yeah.
And and in chapter 8, and it's called Holding Hands with a Warlord. And that's based off of like our first introduction to how men interact, which is fine. But it
Yes.
was a chain
Yeah.
of trust, right? And it's funny. And I think that that is like that chapter in particular speaks to particularly for those of us that lived and fought with the Afghans, speaks to the differences and there's a several stories in there about a character that was known as Afghan Rambo, and it was because of his level of bravery and capability that he took the fight as an A&P officer who then he's not trusted by the ANA. He's not trusted by the Canadians. He's not trusted by the population, and he's hated by the Taliban. And here is this guy that's caught in this like, I'm trying to do the right thing as an Afghan national police officer, to the point that he has to show this extraordinary bravery and crazy heroism every time he faces a conflict. And I find that that chapter, probably out of all the chapters, that's
Mm.
my favorite chapter because that really shows as best as we can, because we haven't had the opportunity, and I've talked to my Afghan partner about this, but there are security risks there about how could we get those voices. That's our best opportunity to reflect those voices that we saw with our partners and allies that fought there. So the next step, like you said, is how do we actually get the voices and their perceptions? Because if I did, 23 months or 24 months in Afghanistan, well, my Afghan partner did every single tour, like he never went home,
Yes,
right?
they were
Well,
there.
and so that would be very interesting. And his perspectives on violence and his perspectives on what worked and what didn't work would be fascinating. And that's the missing link in almost all the discussions is that the view that we take is this our own view reflected,
Yeah.
as opposed to their view. But I think that if anybody wants to kind of get a feel for the warmth and the interesting interactions between Afghans or Afghan security forces and people and Canadians, and that chapter of Holding Hands with a
Yeah.
Warlord is probably.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing it, and thank you so much for coming on. It's been absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Ro. I look forward to talking to you again.